Hello, welcome to 123stitch.com. If you've seen our previous videos, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, thank you so much for being here. My name is Wesley, and today we are going to be taking a historical deep dive into the depths of different quilt patterns. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're interested in seeing more quilting content from us in the future. Now, in our previous Art of Quilting video, we talked a little bit about the general history of quilting as a fiber art form. Today, we're going to be focusing on the development of certain patterns throughout history and how those patterns came to be what we still see and use today. Now, quilting has been all over the world for centuries. The history of quilting is really very fascinating. We have Mongolian floor coverings from the 1st century CE, 3 quilted bed panels from Sicily in the late 1300s, whole cloth quilts made in the Mediterranean circa the 1600s. We have quilted bed coverings, the history of the Indian subcontinent. Middle East and China have a history of creating different quilted clothing. We even have evidence of patchwork from Central Asia and the Korean Peninsula. Today, we are primarily going to be focusing on the history of American quilt patterns and the Western world. However, it is important to note that there is a vast and rich history of quilting from all over the globe. Now, one of the first quilt patterns we're going to be talking about is the crazy quilt. Now, this is recognized as one of the oldest quilt designs that we have record of. Designs similar to this were first found in Egyptian tombs and European courts dated before the 17th century. A hallmark of the crazy quilt is the fact that it's typically made with fabric scraps of a very fine material, so think like silk or satin. You can also very easily recognize a crazy quilt by 3 things. Its irregular shapes and designs, the haphazard use of different fabrics, and also the meticulous embroidery that is typically added to it. In order for something to be a crazy quilt, the fabric has to be 2 things. It has to be high quality and of some sort of sentimental value to the quilter. Now, although crazy quilts are not quite as popular today as they were back in the Victorian era, antique quilt historian Betsy Telford said it best: crazy quilts are not random, they are planned art. And it made a lot of sense if you considered the fashion of the time that these kinds of quilts became so popular. Now, the next quilt pattern that we're going to be discussing is the Rose of Sharon pattern. Now, this is also considered to be one of the oldest quilt patterns in existence. However, its exact date of origin is unknown. We know that it rose to popularity in America in the 1860s and 70s, with a revival in the 1920s and 30s. Typically, these quilts are given as wedding gifts to a new couple. There's a couple different variations of this pattern, but it always includes roses, buds, and leaves in various different arrangements. Another hallmark of this pattern is the colors. It's always a white background with red, pink, green, and sometimes yellow themes. The quilt is always going to be made of 9 different applique blocks arranged based on the quilter's preference. Now, when it comes to the origin of the name of this pattern, the Rose of Sharon, there's a little bit of debate. Many quilt historians believe that the name comes from a Bible verse, the Song of Solomon 2:1, which says, "I am the rose of Sharon, a rose of the valley." Now, this may have been a little bit disproved. Further examination of the biblical texts believe that instead of referring to a rose, it's referring to a tulip or some other type of flower. However, this is still a popular quilting myth for today, with a lot of people creating Rose of Sharon quilts as biblical references. Now, the next quilt pattern we're going to be talking about is the log cabin quilt pattern. Now, this originated in England and Ireland in the early 19th century, but we also have references to it in America going all the way back to 1863, when a Cleveland quilt maker won a special commendation for his log cabin quilt at the Fall, Ohio State Fair. Now, there is some debate around the meaning of the name log cabin quilt. Some historians believe that it relates to Abraham Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign, which linked him to his rural Kentucky roots by calling him a log cabin candidate. William Henry Harrison also campaigned as a log cabin candidate, and we even have quilts remaining today that have images from his presidency. Now, these earlier quilts were created with applique buildings rather than the more abstract block design that we see today. That's why there's some debate around whether or not this is actually referencing the same quilt pattern that we refer to as a log cabin. Now, compared to some other quilt patterns, there is a little bit of mythology surrounding the origin of the log cabin quilts. We have 20th century writing that references a couple different things. Some people say that the center red of the quilt is supposed to represent a cabin hearth, and that it's related to American pioneers traveling to the American West, that they were using these quilts to symbolize safety and home. There's also been a popular myth that these log cabin quilts were somehow related to the Underground Railroad, that the quilts would hang outside of safe houses, indicating to escaped slaves that this was somewhere that they could stay. Now, this myth has been slightly disproven based on different writings at the time. However, it is kind of interesting to think about all of the different ways that quilts could have been used in the American past and in all of these different eras. Next up, we have a slightly less debated pattern, the pinwheel pattern. Now, this one is said to be inspired by the vanes of a water pump windmill, which was very common along the Oregon Trail in the 19th century. We even have a couple different historical examples of these quilts that have been donated to various museums. One such example was donated to the Smithsonian Museum, and it's been dated between 1812 and 1814. This quilt was made by the women of the Adams family during the War of 1812. Then, in comparison to the pinwheel pattern, we have the 9-patch quilt, ever popular. This is dated back to the beginning of the 19th century. Now, the 9-patch quilt was originally invented so that young girls would have an easier time learning how to quilt. As quilt tops get bigger and bigger, it's more difficult to manage the sewing process, especially in a time when you are hand sewing most things. A lot of young girls have said that their earliest memory was creating a 9-patch quilt in their family's homestead. Some of these girls were as young as 3 or 4 years old, but the easy blocks of the 9-patch pattern made it a lot easier for them to learn how to quilt. This pattern also became very popular during the Civil War. Women would use scraps of fabric that were available to them without having to purchase new materials. This quilt pattern made it a lot easier to do that and still end up with a very utilitarian but nice looking product. Then you have friendship quilts. Now, these became popular in the 1840s. Typically, they were created as a group of women got together to create these quilts to give as a going away present to a member of their community that was moving or otherwise going to be leaving the area. Women would create these different quilt blocks and then they would sign their name in different inks, or some women would have curved stamps that would allow them to add their names to the quilts. So that way their friends, would have something to bring with them. Later on in the 20th century, women would embroider their names into these quilts. Now, there isn't a one-size-fits-all for the friendship quilts. While we have a general idea of what they typically looked like, the patterns and the different designs can vary greatly depending on the area in which it was made and the women that made it. However, women would take these quilts with them when they would go to the American West or they would move to a different homestead as a way to keep connection with their friends and family that they unfortunately had to leave behind. A lot of times, historians have been able to use friendship quilts to figure out different things about the past and these women and the lives that they've lived. One woman homesteader from the early 19th century had a quote in her journal that said, "When I get lonely, I read the names on my quilt. It's like putting my arms around someone and giving them a hug." For centuries, people have found different ways to keep in contact with each other, and this continues in the modern day world. Friendship quilts are kind of similar to giving someone a friendship bracelet or a friendship necklace. It's a way to stay connected with the people that you love, even if you're far away from each other. Next up, we have the double wedding ring quilt. Now, this is similar to the friendship quilt in that it's a way to express love between different family members. This quilting pattern has historical traditions relating all the way back to the 13th century. Its origins can be found in things such as the gimel ring in England and Ireland, or the Celtic knot ring, which continues to be popular today. The first paper pattern of the double wedding ring quilt is published in the 1920s. However, we have historical examples of these quilts dating all the way back to the early 1800s. Now, these quilts are symbols of love and connection, with the interlocking rings symbolizing marriage and the wedding vows. Now, historically, mothers and grandmothers would create these quilts to gift to their children either on their wedding days or on anniversaries. Old American folklore suggests that a marriage is blessed if the first couple spends their wedding night together, sleeping underneath one of these quilts. Now, in the early 1900s, we did see a bit of a design shift as rainbow pastel colors became more popular in the mainstream for these types of quilts. A great example of this is this quilt that I have here. This was actually created by my great-grandmother and given to my mother on one of her wedding anniversaries. You can even see here that this quilt features the scalloped edges, which were a very popular hallmark of these quilts. They continue to be in use today, and it's one of those quilt designs that we have a lot of historical examples of, as it would be passed down as family heirlooms. Now the last one we're going to be talking about is the Dresden plate design. Now this was originally published as a paper pattern in the 1920s. However, it didn't become really popular until the 1930s. Also historically referred to as a sunflower or a grandmother's sunburst design. Now what was the inspiration for this pattern? Where did it come from? There's a little bit of historical debate about it. A lot of people agree that this pattern originated in Dresden, Germany, with a specific porcelain plate manufacturer. Now these plates had really intricate designs on them, typically featuring animals or different fruits and vegetables. However, a lot of people think that the quilt pattern, the Dresden plate, became popular because of the maker's mark that was underneath on the bottom of these patterns, or of these plates. That's what kind of inspired the pattern. Unfortunately, a lot of historical context was lost because the majority of these porcelain plates that came out of Germany at the time were destroyed in World War II. So there's a little bit of debate in the quilting community about where exactly this pattern originated from. Now, this quilt pattern is typically made of wedges pieced together. Think of a circle of petals with a circle or applique button kind of in the center of it. It has a very unique geometry to it, kind of a distinctive pattern. A lot of quilters can kind of recognize this pattern on sight because it's so distinctive. As this pattern became popular in the 1930s, women would use scrap fabric from coveted flour and sugar feed sacks. In the 40s, manufacturers, kind of realizing what was going on, would create these flour and sugar sacks with brighter patterns, bolder colors, florals, things like that, with the hopes that women or men would buy their product so that they could use the scrap fabric to make these very intricate and fun quilt designs. Now, as we've discussed the different historical quilting patterns, I hope you've noticed a common thread, which is that quilting has always been a staple of American history, a generational art form that has been passed down throughout the centuries. However, interest in this art form has waned significantly between the 1930s and 40s and then later on in the mid-20th century. Quilting became seen as old-fashioned, something that the older generations would do but that the younger generations weren't quite as interested in. It wasn't as necessary in everyday life to create these quilts from hand. However, one event had a major change in the world of quilting, and this was the Bicentennial celebration in 1976. This was the 200th anniversary of American independence, which was declared in 1776. Something that this celebration really focused on was renewing hope and interest and a feeling of the American patriotic spirit. They did this by encouraging women and quilting groups across the country to create these bicentennial quilts. Now, these quilts varied greatly. There's a whole bunch of different patterns and different ideas that were used, but the through line for it was that all of these quilts represented parts of American history. Quilting has always been seen as somewhat of a political art form. Women create quilts that reflect their current day lives and communities, and this can include things such as women's suffrage or the civil rights movement. Through the use of the bicentennial celebration, quilting became more relevant in the late 20th century. And now, in the 21st century, quilting is becoming more popular once again. As we've developed advancements in technology, videos, the spreading of information about quilting, it's once again becoming a very popular thing that young women, such as me, are learning to do. Thank you so much for watching this video today. If you've stayed until this point, I appreciate you sticking around. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so that way you get notified the next time we post a video. And feel free to leave a comment down below. What's your favorite quilt pattern? Is any of this history surprising to you? Or is there something you want to hear me talk about next? Bye!